The Triumph of Orthodoxy. The Feast of Orthodoxy is celebrated on the first Sunday of the Great Lent, and it commemorates the victory and final defeat of iconoclasm. It is celebrated as a triumph after the Synod of Constantinople in 843. After the Seventh Ecumenical Council, where it was decided that icons would be restored into the churches, the iconoclasts still wouldn't accept their defeat, and icons were continuously banned. And so, in 843, the Empress Theodora, who was the guardian of Michael III, called to an endemusa, that is regional, synod, in order to restore icons into the churches. At the end of the council on the 11th of March, the Empress Theodora, the Patriarch and Archbishop of Constantinople, St. Methodius I, and Theotokos, who was the head of the Regency Council, walked in a procession through Constantinople with an icon of the Theotokos and the child from the Blachernai monastery to the Hagia Sophia, where a liturgy was held. All along the way, people restored icons that they had rescued during iconoclasm back into the churches. This event is related to as the Triumph of Orthodoxy. On the top, we have Michael III, who was 3 years old in 843, holding in his hands a scroll and a cross, symbols of his faith and also of the wisdom he wants to pass on to the observer. His mother Theodora is on his right. Both Michael III and the Empress Theodora are dressed in the imperial color of purple, and they are both covered in gems to show their wealth and power. The Empress Theodora is pointing her hands towards the famous miracle-working Chodietria icon in the middle of the top section, the one said to have been painted by St. Luke himself. This icon was probably chosen to be depicted here, as one of the arguments against iconoclasm was that St. Luke painted the first Theotokos icon. Also, in the Chodietria, the Theotokos is holding her hand in a gesture pointing towards her son, showing us that he's the way. The literal meaning of the Chodietria is actually she who points the way. This is the very core of the icons, guiding us and showing us the way to the faith. The Chodietria here rests on a procession stand, marking that it is used in a liturgical sense. It is larger than anything else in the icon, thus indicating value, that the Theotokos and her child are of God and hold a place in heaven. 2 angels, clad as deacons, as a courtesy to the imperial presence, are by the side of it, holding it, both pointing towards the icon with their hands, directing us to the icon and showing us the way to Christ and God. The Chodietria is supposed to have been kept in the Chodietria monastery in Constantinople, which, according to some sources, was built by Michael III, where it was kept in a specially built tabernacle and brought out for processions every Tuesday. The Chodietria has been described by eyewitnesses up until the 15th century, when it disappeared and has since been lost. Some say it was cut into 4 pieces and split. Others say it disappeared to Russia or Italy. However, St. Luke's Chodietria was supposed to show the Theotokos in full length, which it doesn't here in the icon of the Triumph of Orthodoxy, and so we must assume that this icon painter never saw the original Chodietria by St. Luke. On the right side of the Chodietria, we have the Patriarch St. Methodius I, who walked in the procession alongside the Empress Theodora in the Triumph of Orthodoxy. He is wearing the patriarchal robe and holding a cross and the gospel as signs of his faith and symbols of his purpose in life, to show us the way to God. Next to him are 3 unknown iconophiles. Their names have been chafed off, and we therefore no longer know who they are, but a guess is that they could be Saint Simeon Stylites of Lesbos, his brother George, Archbishop of Mytilene, who were both said to be close advisors to the Empress, Saint Naucratius, who was one of the disciples of Saint Theodore the Studite, or Michael Syncelus, a known iconodule and Syncelus of the Patriarchate of Constantinople under Michael III. All of these are mentioned in the Synaxarion in relation to Saint Methodius I as champions of the Orthodox faith. The one standing closest to Saint Methodius I is forming one of his hands into ICXC, and with the other he's holding the gospel. His gown is a bit more wealthy than the ones of the other 2. The person standing next to him is a bit hidden, while the one on the far right is shown clearly, dressed in a simple chiton, robe, and himation, cloak. He is pointing his hands towards the icon, directing us towards the icon and towards Christ. On the bottom, from the left, we have Saint Theodosia, a martyr from Constantinople. She was a nun who, after her parents died, used the money she inherited to distribute among the poor, and to order 3 icons in silver and gold of Christ, the Theotokos, and Saint Anastasia. In 730, the bronze icon of Christ that was mounted over the bronze gates of Constantinople was ordered to be destroyed. Saint Theodosia, along with some other women, rushed over and pushed the ladder with the imperial guard dismounting the icon. They then stoned the patriarch who had ordered the destruction to death. As punishment, the women were beheaded, and Saint Theodosia was pushed to the ground and was stabbed with a ram's horn through her throat. She is holding an icon of the Christ as representation of the icon she protected with her life, and in her other hand a cross, a sign of her martyrdom. This depiction of the young Jesus without a beard is called Christ Emmanuel and refers to the prophecy by Isaiah that a child called Emmanuel would be born by a virgin. Emmanuel means God with us, Isaiah 7:13. This depiction is popular in Russian Orthodoxy. We can see the cross in the halo, assuring us that this is Christ we see. According to some sources, however, this isn't Saint Theodosia, but the Empress Theodora, who all through her life was an iconophile, hiding her thoughts before her iconoclast husband Theophilos until he died in 842, then bringing back the icons to liturgy before spending her last years as a nun. The 2 men standing next to her are not possible to identify due to chafed-off names. Their clothes are simple. The one standing closest to Theodosia is partly hidden between her and the next person. The third person is holding up his open palms in front of his chest, which could symbolize an acceptance of grace. The fourth person is Saint Dionysius. He was an imperial soldier and an iconoclast from early age, but surrendered to the arguments of the iconophiles and switched sides, instead fighting for the restoration of the icons. He became an ascetic monk and lived on Mount Olympus. He was also a close friend of the patriarch Saint Methodius I and managed to turn the Emperor Theophilus in his last year from the worst of the iconoclasts to iconophile. Saint Dionysius wears a shorter chiton as a sign of his asceticism. He is the only person depicted in this icon who does not have a long chiton. His left palm is held open, a sign of trust, sincerity, and absence of evil, while his right hand is pointing towards the center of the lower row, in which we can see a Pantocrator icon. Next is Saint Stephanos the Younger, who suffered martyrdom in 764 AD. He was one of the most prominent of iconophiles and was imprisoned by the Emperor Constantine V after having refused the decisions of the Iconoclast Council of Hieria. Saint Stephanos was dragged out of the prison in which he was kept and clubbed to death on the streets of Constantinople. He died alongside many other martyrs on the iconophile side. According to some sources, however, this isn't Saint Stephanos, but Saint John of Damascus. Next to Saint Stephanos the Younger is Saint Theodore the Studite, whose defense of the icons is an important iconophile work. In between them, they hold an icon of the Christ as a symbol of the right way. This icon has an unusual round shape, an imago clipiata, usually referred to as an early Christian or a Roman shield, containing the portrait of a famous person, but also used as a triumphant symbol by the iconophiles. In later days, this round shape of the icon is fairly uncommon. With their free hands, they both point towards the icon, directing us to Christ and to God. Next to Saint Theodore the Studite stands Saint Theodore the Confessor, or Saint Theodore the Branded, who was a disciple of Michael Cincellas. He is dressed in a patriarchal robe, holding a cross and the Gospel. Saint Theophanes the Confessor, or the Hymnographer, or Saint Theophanes the Graptus, was the brother of Saint Theodore the Confessor and stands next to him. He's holding a scroll with his left hand, a symbol of the hymns and canons he wrote through heavenly wisdom, while his right palm is held open. They were both champions against iconoclasm, and were both imprisoned and tortured for this. Still refusing to confess to iconoclasm, they were branded with 12 iambic verses on their foreheads. Saint Theodore the Confessor, despite this, still confessed his faith in icons. Saint Theophanus outlived his brother and was made Metropolitan of Nicaea by Saint Methodius I. He lived the remainder of his days composing hymns and canons that are still in use. Standing beside Saint Theophanus the Confessor is an unknown champion of icons whose name has been chafed off. He is partly hidden between the saints he stands next to. Penultimately, we have Saint Theophylactus the Confessor, Bishop of Nicomedia, who also stood up against the iconoclasts. As punishment, his beard was torn out, he was beaten, and was sent into exile. From his exile, where he was continuously ill-treated, Saint Theophylactus continued to fight for the icons. He eventually died in exile, but Saint Methodius I brought his relics back to Nicomedia in 843, after the defeat of the iconoclasm. His garment is simple, and he holds his right palm open. We cannot see his left hand. Last, we have Saint Arsacius, of whom very little is written, but he might have been one of the church fathers present at the Seventh Ecumenical Council in Nicaea in Bithynia in 787. He is also dressed in simple clothes, pointing both of his hands towards the Pantocrator icon in the center. The overwhelming golden background of the icon is there to show us that the uncreated light, the glory and divinity of God and heaven at all times are with us, behind, in front, and around us. It reminds us of the holy illumination we can receive from God. In the center of this icon, we see the Hodeatria as a symbol of every icon ever written. The icon, resting on a procession stand, tells us that this is used in liturgical purposes, and that icons thus have been reinstated in the practice of orthodoxy. In using icons in liturgical processions, such as the one on March 11th in 843, we open up the sacred time and space of eternity and paradise. We connect heaven and earth and become as one in God and Christ. The liturgy is our guide to the sacred, something we can reach through participants. Time becomes eternal and space becomes united in one. Through liturgy, God descends and sanctifies nature and cosmic spaces as well as souls. The icons are proof to us that God is tangible. If God is tangible, then so is the image of God and the divine. Icons mediate holiness and portray imperishability, thus conveying to us the promise of eternity and salvation. In depicting the Hodeatria icon here, we are reminded that icons have always existed in Christianity, all the way from the beginning, when God still walked on this earth through his Son. Icons provide us with guidelines and function as a substitute when there is no Mass to participate in. Below the Hodeatria, in the center and the bottom row, we have Christ Pantocrator. His right hand is raised in a blessing gesture, while he, with his left, is holding a scroll, a sign of the holy wisdom he wants to give us through his generous divinity. We also have the icon of Christ Emmanuel, held by Theodosia. Christ Emmanuel tells us that Christ is the Messiah, the Emmanuel child prophesied by Isaiah. It shows us the duality of Christ in portraying him as a human man, while his expressions show us that he was already at a young age filled with divinity and wisdom. The golden chiton and hemation also shows us the eternal, uncreated light of God and the heavenly kingdom to which Christ will return. All the champions of orthodoxy that we see in this icon remind us to lead lives of chastity and to be true to our faith. This icon indeed symbolizes the triumph of orthodoxy, showing us not only the reinstatement of icons into liturgical practice, but also the very core of the faith, that God let his Son be incarnated so that we could be forgiven through him. By combining divinity and humanity, God to us became tangible and showed us the way to eternity. Icons remind us of all of this, of divinity and humanity, of eternity and heaven. They remind us that Christ lived among us then and still does now and will so until the end of time.